Hello, my name is Chantal Stevens with Solar Washington, and I am happy to welcome you to today's webinar, whether you are watching live or you're watching a recording. Our presenter informed me that the material for today's webinars, the Homeowners Guide to Going Solar, Part 3, Getting and Reviewing Solar Quotes, may be a little bit longer and maybe a little bit denser than that of previous webinars in this series. I want to keep this to our 45-minute time allocation, so there may be little or no time for questions at the end. But still feel free to enter questions in the question pane, and we try to answer what we can either on this webinar or by responding to you directly via email. Again, since most of today's viewers also attended part 1 and 2, I will keep this introduction very short. Solar Washington is an independent, education-based, nonprofit organization for anyone interested in solar. Our work, though independent, is only possible because of the support of our sponsors and members, and we are very grateful for that support. We would like to invite you to get involved and support our vision of a 100% clean energy Washington. You can do that by joining as a member or sponsor if you are not already a member, donating to our work, and register for and attend the 2024 Solar Summit, October 4 in Washington. This is the third webinar in a series of 5 webinars where we take you on a journey from evaluating whether solar works for you to planning all other possible improvements your home can use once solar is installed. Today's presenter will again be Haffner-Ratliffe, who continues to bring a remarkable knowledge and experience acquired while working at a solar installer, being a founding member and the legislative and policy chair of WASEA, working for various state departments on issues as varied as low-income housing, solar, electric vehicle, energy efficiency, and utility-scale renewable energy. And finally, in addition to serving on the Solar Washington board, she's working in government public affairs for a public utility district, and she runs a consulting company that helps people and organizations navigate solar. Deborah?
Thank you. And just one moment while we get the logistics ready to go. All right. There we are. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3. As Chantal shared, this is a pretty dense one. The steps of getting a solar estimate, reviewing your solar estimate, comparing multiple solar estimates, and even looking at the company to see if they're a company you want to work with can get pretty detailed. So today we're really going to try and keep it high level on the most common parts of those processes. Just bear in mind there might be other things that come up or that are important as well. It's just we're gonna try and stick to our timeline today. So we'll do a quick recap of parts 1 and 2, and then we'll talk about the process of getting a solar estimate and what to expect, how to review your solar estimate, and then comparing solar estimates. And then with those, we'll also talk a little bit about what your contract should look like and how to evaluate solar contractors. And then next steps and a quick preview of our presentation that will be this Friday, part 4, what happens next? So quick recap to remind you what you learned in part 1. We talked about the components of a solar installation, the types of installation, roof materials and considerations based on your roof type, energy production and how location, direction, and shade can impact that, how to calculate potential system size, cost, and energy savings, And then we talked about alternatives like community solar and green power programs in case your home isn't suitable for solar. And then also briefly touched on the Homeowners Association rules for solar in Washington State. And then last week during part 2, we covered the incentives and the financing options. So as a reminder, there's a 30% federal tax credit in Washington, or that's nationwide. Washington has a sales tax exemption for standard residential solar installations. And there is a net metering law that each utility might still have. Some might be at another point. Watch part 2 again to learn more about that. And then we touched on how to look up other incentives and policies in Washington State and the types of financing and common loan terms and lending practices to be aware of and potentially watch for. So today we're going to talk about essentially this piece of the process, from getting a quote to being ready to sign a contract. Again, we're not going to be able to touch on all the various nuances of this. We're going to do our best to go over the big, most common pieces. So the process for getting a solar quote can start with going online and filling out a quote or a calculator or a form to be contacted. And even if you do that, once you're ready to go into more depth, or after you fill out a form, you'll end up getting a phone call probably from a sales rep. Sometimes they do a phone call, sometimes it's a text message or an email, sometimes it's a video call. But then you'll have a one-on-one conversation with someone who can actually help answer some of your questions. They'll ask you questions about your home, and they'll usually give you some form of a basic estimate or price point. The second step is one that some companies skip, but I always advocate for having an on-site shade assessment, site visit, site survey. It goes by various names. And we'll talk more about why I think that's such an important step in the process and also what to look for with those. Once you have an on-site assessment, that's really when you should be looking at the quote in detail, because you'll have more information than just what was able to be shared via satellite image or the phone. And you'll also want to figure out how you're financing your solar, whether you're paying cash or one of the other options we talked about in part 2. And then step 4 is to review and compare your quotes. And then once you're happy and confident, you can sign your contract. The one thing that I did not put in a specific place is research the company. Some people like to do that before they even request a quote. Some people will do it after they talk to the sales rep. Some people will do it once they decide that, yeah, this is the quote I want to go with. Let me double check the company. It's a really important step. You might even want to do it at all those various points. But it's just something that doesn't necessarily fit into a specific spot. Just don't wait until after you've already signed the contract. So getting a solar quote, there are multiple ways to do it. Some of these sync together, others are standalone. There are lots of estimator and calculator tools online. On the bottom left of the screen is an example of a solar calculator tool where you put in your address and then it asks for some more information. And then what that calculator does is it'll give you an estimate of what solar should cost, but then it will also share your contact information with multiple solar companies. And a lot of those estimator tools or marketplaces are lead generators. So just be aware that if you fill that out in the terms and conditions, it essentially says we're going to sell your information to solar installers. Not that it's necessarily a bad way to find installers in your area, but it is something where a lot of people think they just get the quote online and don't realize the next step in the process. Another way that some people will end up getting solar quotes is somebody knocks on their door. Door-to-door sales is becoming more and more common with solar, especially in more densely developed neighborhoods. So you might just have someone knock on your door and say, "Hi, I'm with a solar company. Can I talk to you?" And so that is a practice that some companies use, and it tends to come with high pressure sales, but not always. You can also connect with companies directly. There's lots of ways to find companies. You can either go online and look up solar companies in your area. There's also the Washington Solar Industry Association, WASIA. On the top right of your screen is their membership code of conduct. Is just kind of an example of if you're one of their members, you have to go by a specific set of rules. But there's lots of ways to reach out to companies and just get a quote from them directly if you're interested, or talk to other folks that have had solar installed and see who they worked with, or all those types of things. There's also this thing called a Solarize campaign. And what Solarize campaigns are is essentially a bulk buying program for solar installations. The idea is that an installer, or sometimes multiple installers, will offer a discount in exchange essentially for having customers procured through this process. It means they can buy more materials in bulk. It means they can reduce their marketing costs. It's supposed to be something that helps create a discount to the customer. And so there are actually lots of active Solarize campaigns going on in Washington right now. And so that's another way to go about getting a solar quote, is to see if there's a Solarize campaign in your neighborhood and what the potential deals are through that. And then there are also independent solar consultants. A lot of solar consultants are essentially independent sales representatives. So they might work with you, help you figure out the estimate, and then figure out which solar installer is right for you. In those cases, they're typically getting paid by the solar installer. And then there's also independent consultants where they work for you and they represent you and maybe help you review things without having a connection to the installer. So if you want to get a solar quote from a company, there is going to be some information that you need to share. And sometimes people are a little hesitant to give their address to a stranger, a copy of their utility bill to a stranger. But the reality is that the copy of the power bill is what helps the installer determine what utility you're with, which can impact what programs you qualify for, what your energy savings is going to be. A bunch of various things are tied to who your utility is, as well as how the system needs to be designed and the process for interconnection to the utility. It'll also help them determine what the net metering status in your area is, if your utility still offers dollar for dollar net metering. It will show them your annual power use, which will help them determine how much of your energy you can offset with solar. And it'll help them calculate the cost of your electricity. So they should be using the actual rate that you pay your utility, not a statewide average, the actual rate. And then sharing your address is also important, because these are on the screen just some Google images of random houses I found, where to highlight that the site information about where your house is located and what the surrounding trees look like and things like that can actually help the initial conversation from the beginning. So on the top, you'll see that there's 3 houses in a row. One has a south-facing roof, one has a south-facing roof, one has an east-west facing roof. Guess what? The exact same solar installation on any of those houses is going to produce different amounts of energy because of the way that the roofs are facing. And then on the lower part, you can barely see the roofs because they're surrounded by trees. And so those would be examples of, they might say, if you're not willing to cut out trees, we might not be able to do a feasible solar installation for you. So just sharing that address and just looking at the initial images available publicly can help with the conversation from the beginning. Your address will also tell the installer which permitting jurisdiction you're in. We'll talk more about permitting requirements in part 4. And then the other thing solar installers will sometimes use your address for, to be aware of, are looking at your neighborhood sales potential. So if you're in a neighborhood where you have lots of neighbors, or you're on a really busy street that lots of people drive by, versus if you're on a rural road and nobody can see your house from the street, solar installers will sometimes take that into consideration and might offer you a special price or a special discount because they think that there's going to be visibility and potential future sales from your installation. And then the other thing is financial status. Not often, but sometimes solar installers will look at your house and they'll kind of get an assumption about what your budget might be based on which neighborhood you live in, the size of your house, the condition of your house. So something to be aware of there, that it can also inform in ways that changes potentially how things are negotiated. So once you've talked to somebody on the phone, the best thing to do then is to have a site visit. So a site visit allows the installer to do an on-site shade analysis, to not just rely on satellite images or LiDAR images or things like that. The image is actually one of my favorite tools. It's called a Solar Pathfinder. And what you can see is these lines going vertically and little horizontally lines, and those indicate hours of the day and months of the year. And they are calibrated for various locations based on wherever the installer is working, wherever your home may be. And so what it does is it allows the installer with one photograph to tell you, oh, hey, that tree at your neighbor's house is going to X out until about 8:30 a.m. during the summer, any potential solar production. This is how it's going to impact your installation. It'll take your neighbor's houses into consideration. It'll take if you have hills or mountains around you into consideration. It's a very simple and easy way to know exactly what the impacts are of shade and obstructions on your home. Also, sometimes a really nice solar installer will help you figure out where the best place to put your garden is if they're already there with this tool. So if you're curious about that too, you could kill two birds with one stone. The other thing that an on-site assessment allows is to look at distances. Electrical wiring can be pretty expensive. And so if you're looking at doing a solar installation on the farthest right side of your house, but your electrical panel's on the farthest left side of your house, that's potentially a different situation than if you're putting the solar right above the electrical panel and it's a shorter electrical run. So getting a sense of how much infrastructure is going to be needed, what the construction process looks like, those will help get you a more precise quote. And then it also allows the solar installer to evaluate existing infrastructure on your home, your electrical panel and whether or not that needs to be upgraded. If your roof has any structural issues, whether there's going to be any concern about it supporting the solar or if there's a vent that they weren't able to see on a satellite image. And then roofing. The condition of your roofing is something that you can sometimes see remotely, but really looking at it in person is the best way to assess if it's something that would need to be addressed before going solar. And while there are installers that don't always do site assessments, there are some risks for not doing a site assessment. One I found is you're more likely to have a change order. If they're out at your house starting the install and it's the first time they've been at your house and they notice something, they might come back and say, hey, we need to change something. It's going to be more expensive, sign here. The other potential is overpaying. Some installers who don't do site assessments, part of the reason that they don't do site assessments is because they don't need to. They overcharge up front, assuming that there's going to be things that they weren't anticipating. And in those cases, you might end up paying significantly more for the install because of those maybes. And they're not necessarily worried about actually giving an accurate estimate because they've got their costs covered already. And then, of course, all these things and other surprises can cause delays in the process, whether the materials they ordered weren't quite right or there's an electrical panel they weren't anticipating needed to be upgraded. The more you can do to be prepared up front, the easier the process is for everyone. And then the other thing that I want to share is with site assessments, some companies ask for something to be signed prior to that. The risk becomes there are some companies that say, sign here, this is for a site assessment, and it turns out you're signing the complete contract. So that is something to be aware of. And that's where some folks have ended up owing a solar contractor $10,000 if they don't buy solar from them because they signed something thinking it's to approve a site assessment, and it turns out it's committing them to purchase solar from that installer. So this is just an example from a email that I saw where the customer asked for a site assessment, the next step in the process, and the sales rep said, you can cancel anytime, we just need you to sign this document. And you know, if we do the site assessment and you don't like it, then no harm, no foul. But then reviewing the document didn't say anything about canceling after the site assessment. It just went on to list what the cancellation fees are. And so they asked where it says that they can cancel anytime, and the same sales rep came back and said there isn't a clause that says you can cancel. We just make sure we don't charge them. But that's one salesperson, that's not actually in the contract. So before you sign something for a site assessment, just make sure you read through it and understand what it is you're actually signing. And then when you're getting a quote, whether it is a site assessment or just over the phone, you're going to want to make sure that you're getting quotes from multiple companies. So the typical recommendation in Washington State for any construction project on your home is to get 3 quotes. That's the recommended by the State Department of Labor and Industries. And then you're also going to want to look up the company. And again, you can do that at whatever part of the process you're comfortable with. But there are several places that Chantal will post links to. One is the Department of Labor and Industries. They regulate electrical contractors, which you have to be to install solar in Washington State. They also regulate workers' compensation insurance and a few other things as well. And then another link that Chantal is going to share is a report of consumer protection complaints that have been filed with the Washington State Attorney General's office. You can look up a company by name and see how many reports they've had filed. It doesn't mean that they were at fault. It doesn't mean that they did anything wrong. It's just kind of a pulse check on how many people felt that they needed to seek help from the Attorney General's office when working with this company. You can also look at their membership statuses. There's a lot of different organizations that solar installers can be members of. The big one that Chantal will share a link to is the Solar Installers of Washington Association. Sorry, the Washington State Energy Industries Association. It used to be the other one. And so the members, like we showed earlier, have to agree to a certain code of conduct, and as well as in a few other things. So you can always look and see what groups it is they participate in. And then certifications. In addition to being an electrical contractor in Washington State, there are certifications that are specific to solar. One of the most common ones is NABCEP. Please don't ask me to remember what it stands for, but an installer can be certified through NABCEP, a company can be certified through NABCEP, a sales representative can be certified through NABCEP. So it is one of the ways to just kind of assess how much training has this person or has this company done in relation to solar specifically. And down at the bottom, our little screenshot, these are the fields and L&I to help you look at a contractor before hiring. They're generic to all industries, but it's a good guide for hiring any contractor, including solar. So some red flags to watch for. Now, these don't necessarily mean this is bad. These are just things to watch for that often come with issues down the road. So one thing to watch for is if the company doesn't want to do a site visit or requires you to sign a full contract in order to get a site visit. If they do today only discounts, for example, I just saw one the other day where they said, oh, you know, we're doing a special where installation is free if you sign today. And then I did the math and they're already charging 3 or 4 times what the average installation rate should be in Washington State. So those types of things where it's like, oh, hurry up and sign before you have time to do any research or do any homework is something to be aware of. If you're unable to save or download the documents they send you, some installers will just send you a link and those links tend to expire. And if there's no way to download them and save a copy of what you were told, it makes it more challenging if there's a disagreement down the road about what was promised. Same if they won't put anything in writing. If you send an email with a basic question and they want to call you back to discuss, you know, that's fine. Just make sure that if they're really not wanting to put things in writing, that means there isn't a paper trail of what answers you were given or what you were committed to. And then the other thing is inaccurate utility information or data. They should be using your utility rate. They should be using your utility name. If they're saying things like your utility rate goes up by 20% every year, and there's a little asterisk by it, like read what's down by the asterisk. Sometimes they're using data from the Midwest to show like the average escalation where you might be with a utility that doesn't have that average escalation rate. So just number check can be a way to make sure that you're being provided accurate information. And then if what is said doesn't match the contract, like the example I gave earlier, the sales rep said you can cancel anytime, but the contract doesn't say that, that can be a red flag because the contract is going to be what is legally binding. And then the other thing is no electrical license listed on a quote, or the license isn't for that company. In Washington State, electrical licenses have to be listed on advertisements and on quotes. And so if there isn't an electrical license, or if the electrical license doesn't sync up with what the name of the company is, the licenses are typically based on the name of the company. So if they don't look like they make sense why that would be their license number, that's a red flag. And you can also go to L&I to look up the license number and see what company it's listed with. You can also go in and see search by company name and see what their electrical license status is, and that will also show you their workers' compensation account, as well as permit or safety violations that L&I has cited them for. So we're going to go over solar quotes super quick, super high level. If anyone has a specific situation or more specific questions, please feel free to email them. It's just limited on time, so we're going to do what we can do. So let's say you got 3 solar installation quotes, option 1, option 2, and option 3. The installed size for option 1 is 7.5 kW, and they want to charge you $26,500. Option 2 is 8.75 kilowatts with a price of $21,500. So a bigger system, lower price. And then option 3 is a really big system, 11.7 kilowatts for $45,000. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the difference is on these, what to look for, and again, very high level. So let us know if there's specifics. When you compare a solar estimate and review a solar estimate, the things you're going to want to look for are things like the system size, the system costs, the energy production and savings, the payback calculations, the warranties, and the timelines of when the installer says they'll be able to install it for you. What we're not going to cover today is financing. That's just a little more complicated, and the solar quote itself should be its own standalone analysis. You can always figure out a different lending option, and there's much more rules out there about lending, so we're going to focus on the quote itself today. So with your 3 options, we're going to say that option 1, the 7.5 kW system, has 15 solar panels. The wattage of the panels is 500 watts each. And so we're confirming that the total system size is 7.5 kW. And that install is going to have an inverter that's rated at 7.6 kW. Option 2, the contract lists the system at 8.75 with 20 panels that are 430 watts each. But that math actually adds up to 8.6 kW. So there's a discrepancy there. And then that system, let's say, has the same inverter size, 7.6. And then option 3, an 11.7 kW system, has 26 panels at 450 watts each for an 11.7 kW system confirmed with a 10 kW inverter. So the reason I add the inverters is, with the exception of like micro inverters and those more specific inverters that we covered in part 1 of the series, the inverter acts as a limiter in terms of how much energy can go from the solar panels into your house or into the grid. So an 8.6 kW system with a 7.6 kW inverter could mean that the inverter is undersized. Now, there are reasons you would do that. If you have a system that faces west and it might never produce at peak capacity, that could be a reason. If you have a system that is facing 2 different directions, so it's never producing at full capacity at the same time, that could be a reason. But one of the things to watch for is what's the expected output of the system, what's the size of the system, and how does that compare to the inverter size? And if you have questions about that, your installer should be able to answer them for you and explain it to you. So looking at system cost, option 1, what we do is we take the total price of the system and we divide it by the total system kilowatts. And then there's also a factor of 1,000 to turn it into from kilowatt to watt. We go over that calculation in part 1 of the series. So in this example, option 1, the price per watt is $3.53, which is on the higher side for Washington State. Option 2 calculates out to $2.50, which is low. And not only is it low, we're calculating that based on the smaller system size that we calculated when we compared what they said the kilowatts were going to be to what the panels and the quantity of panels actually calculated out to. And then option 3 comes out to $8.85 a kilowatt. Now, that's significantly overpriced. It's also interesting and potentially concerning because typically the larger the install, the lower the price per watt, because some of the installation work is just set. It doesn't matter how many panels you're doing or not, there's that fixed infrastructure cost. So the largest system being the most expensive per watt would be concerning. Energy production. Again, we go over how to do these calculations in presentation 1, but let's pretend you have a southwest facing roof with some shade in an area where 1,300 kilowatt hours per year will be produced per kilowatt installed. Excuse me. And so now let's look at what the annual kilowatt hours the installer says it will produce versus my back of the napkin calculations. So for system 1, let's say the installer said it would produce 9,750 kW, and it's a system size of 7.5. Well, if we take things like the direction, so southwest doesn't produce as well as straight south. Let's say there's some shade, so that means you're not going to get the full hours of sunlight you could. So a system that's southwest facing and has some shade will likely not produce at the ideal kilowatt hour ratio. So if they say, hey, this system's going to produce 1,300 kilowatt hours a year, they might not and probably aren't taking those other factors into consideration. So in this case, it's a significant difference, almost 1,000 kilowatt hours less per year if you take those factors into consideration. Option 2, let's say the installer said it was going to produce 9,520 kW per year. And I compared that to the 8.6 kilowatts installed that we calculated earlier. And I didn't necessarily worry about the inverter size because, again, there could be reasons that a smaller inverter makes sense. But in this case, I calculated more than the solar installer quoted, so 9,924. Now, the reason some installers might underestimate is for their own warranty and reputation. They don't want to overpromise. They don't want to overcommit. So they'll give you an estimate that's a little bit more on the conservative side, or they're doing a better job of taking the direction and the shade and those things into consideration. So just be aware that maybe the lower kilowatt hours produced is actually the better system or is actually the more honest system. So just to be aware of that. And then option 3, let's say they said it was going to produce at 14,625 kilowatt hours. When I did my calculation, it was 13,501. Same kind of thing. Did they take the direction? Did they take the shade? What were they using for their base ratio in terms of potential for insulation and energy production? And then looking at the energy savings. So let's pretend that you live in an area where you have net metering available with a dollar for dollar, kilowatt for kilowatt credit, and you produce, your energy cost is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So you're either going to save 10 cents per kilowatt hour if you use the electricity the system produces, or you're going to get a credit for 10 cents a kilowatt hour on your utility bill. So going back to the last slide, this is taking what the installer estimated the production was going to be versus what I, through my pretend calculations for this presentation, estimated what the energy production was going to be. And this shows you what that financial difference is. So if an installer says, 9,750 and I say 8,655, that's over $100 a year in energy savings being overestimated potentially by the solar installer. And so even though it's, it's just 10 cents, it's just a few hundred kilowatt hours, the financial impact over the life of the system can be significant. So if we look at the payback calculations, which is something that a lot of people look at when they're considering solar, what you do can vary. Some installers take the equity value of the solar into consideration when they give you those numbers. Some take the potential escalation of your energy costs and inflation of energy costs into consideration. For the purposes of today, we're only looking at system cost and the 10 cents per kilowatt hour energy savings because we just don't have time to go into the other details. So for option 1, after the tax credit, assuming you qualify for the tax credit, that's the other thing, is if you don't qualify or you won't qualify for the tax credit, you should be using the full system number, not the reduced number. So after the tax credit, and if you look at the estimated annual savings, the installer might tell you that that system is going to pay for itself in just over 19 years. But when we look at it with the numbers I calculated, it becomes 21 years. Same kind of example with option 3. If you look at what the installer said that you would save in energy costs versus what I estimated you could save in energy costs, that's about a 2-year difference. Now, this doesn't necessarily matter to most people because most of us only live in our homes for about 7 years. But what it can indicate that could impact you is the accuracy of the information, the expensiveness of the system, what costs they're considering against your primary cost if they're taking things like escalating energy costs into consideration. So it's just something to be aware of and look at in terms of another metric for the overall data in the proposal. So production warranties for solar panels. There's workmanship warranties that are just this panel is warranted for X years. Production warranties are where it gets really complicated, and that is this panel will produce X percentage of energy at a certain year based on what it was originally manufactured for. So let's say installation 1, option 1, they're using 500 watt panels, and those panels are warranted that at year 30, they're still going to produce 89.3% of that 500 watts of power. So that means at year 25, and you'll see why we do 25 in a moment, that panel will still be producing 454 watts of power. Panel 2, this is our cheapest install, if you remember, at $250 per watt. The wattage of the panels is 430, and they're guaranteed that they'll still be producing at 85% at year 25. So that means at year 25, they're only producing 365 watts. And then panel 3, the larger system, it's a 450 watt panel that says it'll produce 92% at year 25. So that is 414 watts at year 25. Now, the thing with panel 1 that may or may not matter to you is that you're essentially guaranteed 5 more years of energy production with those panels than you are with the other 2. So the other 2 panels, if they're not producing what they should be or what you expected, or there's an issue at year 26, too bad, so sad. But with panel 1 at year 26, 27, 28, they're still warranted to be producing energy by the manufacturer. And so the warranty at year 25, again, might not matter to you. You might not plan on having your home or your installation for that long. But what production warranties are is they're a decreasing metric. So imagine just a graph getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. And so in this example, this solar panel has a workman warranty of up to 25 years and the power or production warranty of 30 years. But they break it down into the first year, it'll be producing at 98%. The 12th year, we still promise it'll produce at 94.7%. Year 25, we promise. Well, you might care a lot more about year 12 than you do about year 30. But it gives you an idea of what is the rate of decrease of performance. So even if you're not thinking 20, 30 years out with your solar installation, it's still good to know what is the production warranty so that you can compare at whatever point in the timeline you might be concerned about. And this is from a SILFAB panel that I believe is manufactured in Washington. So contract terms, when you get your estimate, typically it is separate from the contract document, but they'll often send you the contract document or sometimes even want you to sign it prior to getting a site assessment. So there has now been a law passed that is now effective, House Bill 2156. It's the Solar Consumer Protection Act is what it's been being called. And so under that law, in addition to rules that already existed, like having your electrical license listed on your estimates and things like that, there's now items that are legally required in the contract per that consumer protection law. And then there's also some things to just watch out for in general that may or may not be aligned with a legal requirement, but just seeing like they should say in the contract what are the cancellation fees. And so you can look at those cancellation fees and figure out if they're reasonable or if they're higher than you're comfortable with. Look for things where they decline to take responsibility for things like what a salesperson says. I saw one contract that said that the company isn't responsible for anything the salesperson said, even in writing. And then, they should be responsible for changes that have to happen because of building code or utility or things like that. So just take a look at the contract in detail and please read the contract before you sign it. Those DocuSigns are so easy to just click next on. Don't do that. Actually take time to read the documents. So what's next? If you're going to move forward, get at least 3 estimates. Again, that's the state recommendation for any construction project on your home. I really encourage you to have a site survey, but again, look out for those red flags of being required to sign a full contract before you do. And then look at your financing and potentially the savings from your solar, and you can review that in part 2, understanding incentives and solar financing options, which is recorded and on the website. Check out the contractors, their qualifications, their memberships, their safety records. There's so much that's publicly available information. If you need help with that or have any questions, please feel free to send us an email. And then review the quotes and compare the quotes and look at each quote not just as its own individual quote, but how it compares to the others that you received. So on Friday, we'll be doing part 4. The title is What Happens Next? We're going to cover basically everything from when you sign the solar installation until you decide either to sell your home or have the solar install removed, such as how long should the installation take? What if there's a warranty issue? What happens when I sell my house? What if a tree falls? What if one of the panels breaks? Does solar increase my home value? What are the impacts of that? So we hope to see you part 4 on Friday. And thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, Dever. We indeed do not have time for any questions right now. So we will be moving on. I did want to mention, because you did bring it up earlier in the presentation, that we will have a webinar later this month, I believe on the 25th, June 25th, on solar consumer protection. And I think that should be a really good one for anybody who's really at this point of looking at installing solar on their homes to join. We will be looking at what the new law says, what contractors can and cannot do as a result of it. And you'll find that, I think, very nice to know that some guidelines have been published and some limits have been put on what is possible right now, given all those interesting cases that Deborah covered in her presentation. So again, we will be sending a link to a recording of this message in the next, actually in the next 24 hours. Somebody asked, we will not put the link to the we will not put the links that Deborah mentioned into that email, but we will put a link to the page where you can find them. So we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar coming up in just a few days. And just want to wish you a very good week and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.